I'm Rory O'Neill, Ballinrobe, County Mayo, international drag superstar. Cut. Like, I wouldn't want to overstate the importance of a drag queen leading a parade, but I do think it does say something about where Ireland is now and how far Ireland has come, really, in a lot of ways. But I do hope also that younger queer people watching that, Irish queer people specifically, will realise that, that they don't have to be limited by their queerness. Queerness is just a naturally occurring part of you and part of society, and any decent, properly functioning society should welcome it, and does welcome it. And I'm not foolish enough to think that Ireland is perfect in any way, and we have our own issues at the moment. But certainly I think Ireland is a brighter, more welcoming, better place now than it was when I was growing up. Well, see, I have a pet theory that there's a sort of a synergy between Irish people and drag, and I think that because when I was growing up, the most famous drag queen in the world by a long, long way was Danny La Rue, and people under a certain age might even scratch their heads about who Danny La Rue is, which I have found out to my horror and shock over the years. But if you ask your parents or your grandparents, they all absolutely know who Danny La Rue is. Danny La Rue was the highest paid entertainer on British television through the 70s. He was BBC Entertainer of the Year on 3 separate occasions. I think he still holds the record on the West End for the most tickets ever sold to a show by a single entertainer, because his show, Sunday Night at the Palladium, ran for, 15 years or something, and he sold millions of tickets. So through the sort of 70s and early 80s, he was as big, as successful, as famous as someone can be in the British entertainment industry. And he was from a tiny little working man's cottage in Cork, and always remained incredibly proud of his Irish background. And so, by far the most famous drag entertainer this country has ever known, Britain. And then later, in the 90s, of course, Lily Savage came along, and there always seems to be this thing that you can only be one famous and successful drag queen at a time in the UK. So Lily Savage came along, and Lily, of course, was born and reared here in Britain, but as Irish as they come, from good, strong Irish stock, and again, very proud of his Irish roots. And then it's slightly different, but you could make an argument that in more recent years, the most famous drag performer in Britain is Mrs. Brown. Now, it is different because it's sort of that's more what I'd call pantomime drag rather than the queer drag tradition that I come out of. But I do think that is interesting, the Irish connections. And then it does slightly go the other way too, because again, if you ask your parents in Ireland to name a drag queen, there's a very good chance that they're going to say Mr. Pussy. And Mr. Pussy, of course, is English originally, who came to Ireland in the 70s to do a gig, I think at the Jury's Inn Cabaret, if memory serves me correctly. And then he just never left, because at the time, he was, like a rainbow. People had never seen anything like that before in Ireland. And he loved it and stayed, and for many, many years, traveled up and down the country on the cabaret scene. It's interesting to me that the most famous drag performers this country has ever known were Irish, and the most famous drag queen in Ireland for so many years was English. But I do think there is something in that about Irish people as entertainers and queer people. Also, I think it's interesting too, because so many Irish queer people over the generations, until relatively recently, fled Ireland. Because they couldn't be queer at home. And so many of them, of course, came to the UK and to London specifically. So in a way, it also doesn't surprise me that a lot of Irish queers end up being successful queers here. Drag, that kind of queer drag tradition, and especially here in the UK, is very much, a performance art, a comedy art, in most often here in the UK. And as you know, Irish comedians have always been very successful in the UK. And we have our great sort of storytelling, slagging, yarn telling, banter, gift of the gab Irish thing, and that definitely helps when you're a drag queen. I mean, most of the work for British drag queens was, end of the pier or drunken, noisy pubs. Pretty much a stand-up gig, really, and dealing with hecklers is what drag queens do. So I think being Irish probably really did help Danny La Rue and Lily Savage and so on. So I think it definitely is fair to say that their Irishness influenced them. Now, did their drag influence the scene in Ireland? I think that's a bigger stretch, but what I would say that British drag in general definitely has influenced our scene. The Irish drag scene is unusual, I would say, in that there really was none to speak of until the 90s, really. Like when I first went looking for drag gigs in Dublin, there was none to be had. And so I had to create a queer drag gig. And I mostly, as the years went on, did that by promoting my own nights. But my very first gig, I had been working in Tokyo and elsewhere before, and I came back to Dublin in '95. And they had just changed. Well, first of all, homosexuality had been decriminalized while I was away. So suddenly there was the possibility for openly queer places to exist, which were not possible when I was a student, for example, in Dublin. There were nightclubs for the first time. And I thought, oh God, I need a gig. I need to pay me rent. And the only thing I knew how to do was drag gigs. And there wasn't any. So I spent 2 weeks, and I went out every single night in all the gear to all of the current club nights at the time. And I chose the one that I thought, this is the most fun one, and this is the crowd that would get me most. And it was a mixed night on a Monday night called Strictly Handbag. And it was in the Kitchen nightclub, which had just been bought by U2 at the time, so it was all a bit achingly cool. And I went there for a few weeks in a row, and then eventually I said, if you pay me, I'll come here every week. And that's how I got my first drag gig. And at that time, there wasn't really any other drag. Mr. Pussy was still around, but Mr. Pussy always was on the straight cabaret scene. And if you went in, the George was there at that time, but much smaller then. Like if you went into the George then, they didn't have many performances or anything. There was a couple of the barmen who, every now and then would throw on a silly wig and a dress and do a few numbers in the corner. The George was much smaller then. And their drag names were Dolly Mount Strand and Peach Carbolic. And but that was about it. They were actually the barmen or whatever. It was very on an amateur basis. So there was no drag scene. But obviously, we had been influenced by pantomime drag, which I guess is originally a British tradition, and we took that to heart. And of course, then we knew of Lily Savage and all of that, and the Brighton end of the pier business and all of that. And it's interesting, American drag is very focused on how people look, and part of that reason is their drag pageant culture, but also in American nightclubs, drag queens they were just like go-go dancers more so than doing shows. So how they looked and being able to do the splits and all of that became very important in American drag circles. Whereas in British drag circles, drag queens were, in the pub, in the corner of a smoky pub, making people laugh and singing, I Did It My Way, and pulling the wig off at the end. And how they looked didn't matter a damn. English drag was never about that. So English drag was always kind of a stand-up comedy kind of vibe, and very different from the American one. And then when a drag scene developed in Ireland, I think what developed was something that's kind of an amalgamation of both of those and some more Irish tradition. And I think Irish drag audiences expect to go to like a show that'll have a beginning, a middle, and an end, which American audiences wouldn't ever really expect it. And British audiences also expect a few one-liners, a bit of slagging, oh, I did it my way and pull off the wig. So it's funny that Ireland, developing its own drag scene late, sort of took influence from lots of different places and ended up with a scene that I think is fairly unique in its own way, in a good way. Danny La Rue, and even to an extent, Lily Savage, and you could throw in other people like, say, Julian Clary, that in order to bring their dragginess, queerness into the mainstream, they had to sort of elude their queerness a bit. Danny La Rue always started his show by saying, "Watcha mates," which was a shorthand way of saying, everybody calm down, I'm not really that gay. I'm actually a bloke. I'm a proper bloke, in a dress for the fun. And I remember when I was kids, we'd see Danny La Rue on the television. He'd often appear in this show in the good old days. And I have this, like, such a weirdly clear memory of my father, telling us in a very amused tone, he's got a wife and 6 kids at home. Because that was the story that they allowed to go out there, because it made him more palatable and less scary. If the idea was, he's actually not a flaming queen, And I think Lily Savage too, her act being so overtly, the real Lily Savage, the character was meant to be a streetwalker, It's meant to be a street hooker, totally tragic. Now she toned it down a bit to go be on television and all, but not that much. But I think that it was so over the top in its micro minis and leopard skin, bet behind the bar of Coronation Street familiarity, that it made it palatable to mainstream audiences. And then even people like Julian Clary, who absolutely was putting his queerness front and center, but he was doing it in a way that sort of made a clown act of it. So again, it seemed unthreatening. And then speaking of Irish queer performers, in the UK, you could Graham Norton, who's obviously always been very open about his gayness, but at the same time, he does it in a charming, non-threatening way for mainstream audiences too. And so I think that's interesting, that they sort of had to elide their queerness. And I think, in Ireland, we had to hide our queerness all the time until relatively recently. But I think they elided their queerness, and part of that too was promoting their Irishness. A nice Catholic boy from Cork doesn't sound gay and threatening. And, Paul O'Grady from a nice Catholic family in Liverpool or Manchester doesn't sound super gay and threatening. But I do think that what Irish drag queens have managed to do, or what Irish drag saw that maybe drag in other places didn't often see, I mean there are of course exceptions, is the political power of drag, or the ability of drag to cut through a lot of nonsense and say something real and serious. I often, over the years, I have plenty of serious things I want people to hear from me, and I want to do them through drag because I think it helps amplify my voice and explain the messages I'm trying to do, in its own way. And I think it's very, and sometimes I would often, at home in Ireland too, people are interviewing you. If they want to interview you about serious things, they don't want Panti to do it. They specifically want Rory to do it, because they think they can't ask Panti a serious question. Which always made me laugh, because I think most of them even know about Panti because of serious things, But I think Irish drag has managed to do that, to put like one foot in a serious place, which I think a lot of Irish art and theatre and literature manages to do. I think most of the most successful Irish theatre and Irish films even have you laughing and crying in equal measure and often at the same time. I think Irish people are very good at that, at dealing with the serious in a way, you know, that can be funny. You know, the slagging, all of that. And I think that works really well for drag queens. And I think in other parts of the world, the drag scene hasn't, or drag queens have been interested in tapping in very much to that same thing. Of course, there are lots of exceptions, but and so I think outside of Ireland, even more than in Ireland, they can be quite surprised, you know, to hear serious messages from drag queens. You know, everything's very light and end of the pier and funny, and that's what they want only from drag queens. Many exceptions, of course, but I think in Ireland it's funny, we've managed to develop a scene that does both and everyone accepts that as totally normal. You know, I was part of a double act for many years in Japan with an American queen from Atlanta, Georgia, who, you know, which is sort of the spiritual home of American drag. And lots of the most famous, including RuPaul, came out of that Atlanta scene. And so, you know, in Japan, our act was very much you know, this blending of, you know, her real American, you know, big hair, beautiful makeup, you know, kooky drag. And then I think what I wanted to do is more influenced out of, I'd been in art college, I'd started doing drag in art college, so I was more interested in kind of, you know, nutty, artsy stuff at the time. And then, of course, the sort of British, jokey, you know, tradition. And then also, I think, you know, my own Irishness comes through in what I ended up doing, you know, specifically in the kind of theatre shows I'm still doing to this day, but the kind of things I was always interested in was telling stories. So I actually think of myself nowadays as a storyteller, which is very Irish of me. Like I'm a Shanachie, I'm just doing it, you know, I'm a Shanaqueer. So yeah, I think I am sort of this, you know, a very obvious example of this sort of taking elements from other drag cultures and then making something quite Irish out of it. In queer scenes all over the world, drag queens are very prominent in queer issues. And that is simply by dint of the fact that drag queens have a louder voice than most queer people, because drag queens are on stages with microphones in their hands. Drag queens get to have microphones at Pride and all that. So I think drag queens often feel that they have to talk about the issues that are important to the community. So they do. Outside of the queer community, I think it's outside of Ireland anyway, I think, you know, people who aren't involved in the queer community, you know, are always stunned to hear something, you know, serious from a drag queen. They don't get that at all. Whereas I think in Ireland, even outside of the queer community, people are quite used to that, which is, you know, definitely different. Was it always like that? I don't think so. I remember, like, when I would first be on, like, serious things, you know, Pat Kenny interviewing me or something, and he'd have to say Panti Bliss live on air, and there used to be, like, a little hesitation, and, you know, nowadays, no. One of the beautiful things about a classic drag show, as opposed to lots of other forms of theatre, and something that has in common with stand-up comedy, is you can say what you want. There isn't a script, per se. You're usually on your own. There are no rules of engagement. And you can say whatever is on your mind. And in drag shows, you're performing on the same stage, in the same venue, every single week, sometimes every night, in a way that even stand-up comedians aren't usually doing. So you're often doing it to audiences that are super familiar with you, who think of you as a friend, know all of your history, have been to your show 50, 100, 300 times before. And that allows you a certain comfort and an ability to say anything. You can say the most outrageous thing and it won't be picked up wrong because that audience knows you so well. So that allows you great leeway to say things. It also means that whatever is on your mind that day, you can talk about. Because for this audience, they didn't just come tonight specifically to see this particular show. They're coming for your atmosphere that you've been creating for years, months, whatever. And so it really gives you a freedom to just say what's on your bloody mind. And then drag queens get used to that. And we just end up saying what's on our mind all the time. So there's a real, freedom in being alone on a stage with a microphone with an audience who lets you say whatever you goddamn please. And it's funny, a lot of people, maybe even a lot of you watching this, will first know me. If you're not from the queer community or the theatre performing community, it's a good chance you first heard about me because of that speech in the Abbey. And when they asked me to do that, I was in the middle of this legal nonsense, and I was very busy, and I didn't really want to do it because it was like, oh God, something else actually. But then I said to the director of the Abbey at the time, "Can I say whatever I want?" Because at that time I was not allowed to say whatever I wanted. There were, it was all in the newspapers and in the radio and all that. But they would never just let me say everyone because everyone was afraid of defamation suits and all sorts of legal wrangles or whatever. So I just thought, well, actually, I could be on stage at the Abbey and can I say whatever I want? And he says, it's live theatre, you can say whatever you want. So I thought, right, I'm actually going to do this and I'll say exactly what I want. And I think just, being a drag queen, prepared me for that, for saying exactly what I want. So yeah, I do think drag audiences are not easily shocked and they allow you great leeway to find your voice or to say things that people who aren't so familiar with you might take up wrong or not understand all the subtleties, but your drag audience does understand all of those subtleties, comes from the same community as you and is incredibly familiar with you and your background and how you got here. So it's actually a beautiful, exciting, freeing place to be as a live performer. Well, obviously I think it's kind of funny that nowadays Ireland is seen as so progressive on these kind of issues and all that, because obviously for most of my life it absolutely wasn't. And then we kind of leap forward ahead, which I think is interesting too. I think that's a lot to do with the size of Ireland and how Ireland developed, and that we can sort of make changes quite quickly. And obviously I'm thrilled about all of that. It does still amuse me sometimes, turning up to meet the ambassador and the mayor with a name like Panti Bliss, and all the Irish people know exactly what's going on and get it. But I think it's also super appropriate that it was London, because London, is a home away from home for generations of Irish queer people.